1st of November 905, All Saints' Day. The man in the bed, sheets pulled to his chin, crinkled eyes closed, did not look like Bika. His face was pale, a blue tinge to it, like 4-day-old milk. He had no hair, or beard, his skin gaunt over his skull. Osrith looked down to Edra. She was just staring at the bed, not scared or upset. Then between the nun and Hild, Bika. The name slipped from Osrith's lips. It wasn't a question, but Hild took Osrith's hand and placed it onto his. It was cold, as bone, and thin as parchment. Osrith touched her fingers to the back of it, fearing she may damage his hand. Instead, his fingers moved and he opened his eyes. "Don't strain yourself," the nun gasped, bending to him. "Father Bika." Osrith spoke his name again. The first priest she had known, who had guided her, comforted her, taught her. He looked so old, and Osrith was astonished. In her mind, Bika, Bibbenberg's priest, Alfred's priest, Thyra's husband, was still a thinning, red-headed man, able to wield sword and shield, as he had done beside her brother and the Etheling Edward at Beamflout 5 years before. She remembered him coming back from that battle, too. It was when she had learned, from Thyra, that he had been slaughtered by Uhtred in order to redeem the soul of their brother Agnar. He had murdered the Danish warrior. That hateful excuse for a man, Ethelwold, gone, dead. But that still left her brother. He knew the rumor of her, and sought vengeance for Osrith still. It was why she had run. It would never have ended well for her, if she had stayed. Uhtred blamed her for Gisla's death. Abuse at the hand of Ethelwold may not have, in the end, been enough for him. So she had decided she was better off in Alba. Osrith felt Sainid take her by the shoulder. It was steady, his touch was focusing her. But she hadn't counted on her impossible feelings for Finan, so strong still after all this time. Nor had she counted on a newborn being handed to her, to nourish, to mother. She reached down to Edra. The girl, looking thoroughly tired and on the brink of demanding food again, looked pleadingly at Osrith, her mouth beginning to quiver. That was how the girl managed to get what she wanted, anything she wanted, from Constantine. So, she must be strong. "We have come so you may see your father, child." Osrith pointed to Bika, who was pulling himself up onto his pillows, despite the cautions of the nun. "Father Bika," Osrith said, as he looked at her. There was recognition in his eye, and also pain, and something lurched in Osrith's chest, feeling a wrench of sadness. Had it been so long? So much had changed. "This child," Osrith began, then, turned to Hild and Sainid. "I need to be alone with him, for this," she said, translating this to Gaelish. "Hild, can you show Sainid where he can get some rest and food?" And to Sainid told him the nun would show him where to wait. "About Thursday St. each?" Sainid asked. "Are you sure?" "She may find you ale," Osrith said in English. "Byard, lion, you Beetha?" Sainid asked, hopefully. Osrith smiled. "Is Docker lion Mathq idaged?" Sainid grinned, folding his sword over his shoulder, and he followed Hild as she opened the door back to the hall. "You too?" Osrith snapped, as the nun who had been nursing Bika sat down next to him. "But, my lady, I am no lady." Osrith spat, hand over Bue's hilt, and she glared as the nun retreated, the woman shaking her head. By now, Bika had inched his way up the bed, his eyes fixed on Osrith as if she were a spectre, trying not to move or blink. "Edra," he managed, through cracked lips, and Osrith moved to the wooden cup on the table beside him, filling it from the stone jar, then placing it by his lips. "Oh, Edra," he spluttered, taking her hand away, and tears began to form in his eyes. "Dear child." He held up a hand to Osrith's face. "Osrith," she corrected him, gently, as the child crept closer to her leg. "This is Edra," Osrith announced. "I have brought her to see you." Edra's bright little eyes fixed on Bika, her father, and she stared at him. "Get a good look," she told the girl, silently. "He is your father. Remember today." Bika reached out a hand, and suddenly looked younger. The analytical glint that had been lost in his eye was now there. He was alert, thinking, as his huge, bat ears stuck out, as they had once done. "Edra," Osrith said. "This man is your father." "Father Bika," The precocious girl said, in English, "I heard you say so, Mama." "Your child, Osrith?" And the old Bika was back, pertinent questions asked, shrewd thinking done. "I act as her mother," Osrith said, carefully. "As Constantine of Alba acts as her father. I pay him enough to, after all." And then, suddenly, Osrith cried. Deep, frame-wrenching sobs echoed around the room, echoing and building as more added to them. She placed a hand on Bika's bed, as the last 6 years tumbled from her body. How long she cried for, Osrith didn't know, but eventually the emotion waned and she spoke. She spoke of the day of Alfred's funeral, of leaving Winchester. She spoke of being tricked and assaulted by Ethelwold. Osrith plunged on, driven by a knot of spite that he had once refused her help she sought, knowing that this information would score into the old priest's soul. She spared no details and Bika listened, in silence. When Osrith imagined her meeting Bika with Edra, she had always thought she would tell him only about his daughter, then leave. But the mountain of grief on her shoulders had shifted, and it had toppled from its perch high in the back of her mind until it was a pile of rubble before Bika. She waited for the old man to say something, and after a time, reaching for Osrith's hand, he did. She took it, as Bika looked into her eyes. "Uhtred, the boy I knew, the man I know, would not have meant anything to happen to you, his sister." Bika's defense of her brother was predictable. But he was dying, so Osrith ignored the sound of her own mind, hearing the truth of that day. She had heard him with her own ears. Ethelwold had, with relish, told Uhtred he knew who had called the heathen Britons to Gisela and heard what Uhtred would like done with them. Ethelwold had named her. Uhtred had told him to act on his behalf. Osrith shook her head, as if trying to shake the memory loose, and changed the subject to Edra. So she told him it was the day of Alfred's funeral that she had decided to leave. "And, as I hurried, I saw a man, chasing Thyra." As she had predicted, Bika gave Osrith a sharp look. "I chased them, but he had got into your home," Osrith continued, knowing, now, there was no turning back. Just the facts, as she had rehearsed. The man had gained entry. He had found Thyra, but she had hidden. She fought back. But the man had lit a fire. Osrith watched Bika's face, carefully. Edra watched Osrith, in silence, as if knowing Osrith's words held significance for her, too. She did not die. Bika's words were deliberate and pronounced with emphasis. But Osrith ignored his question. "I carried Thyra out. She was still alive. I got her to Allah, the heathen Britons." Osrith nodded. "Hanged, 3 winters ago," Bika said, "for witchcraft." Osrith shuddered. That could have been her, too. It still could, if Uhtred had a mind to spread the rumor. She was very much alive then, Osrith stated, pointedly. She could do nothing for Thyra but deliver her of a healthy baby girl. And Osrith took Bika's hand from her own and placed it onto Edra's, leaning towards the old priest. "She has grown, now." She looked down to Edra. "Meet your daughter." But he did not move. Had he heard? For some time, Bika said nothing, but looked at Edra, at the image of his wife in that 6-year-old child. At length he ventured to speak. "Who is she, Osrith?" he asked, his voice low and steady, as if gulling a truculent child to part with the truth. "I told you, she of Thyra." But his temper was up, and he leaned towards her, as he had done so often when she had lied as a child. His face creased, and the frail man, close to death as he had appeared, was now angry. "Do not lie to me, wicked girl!" he raged, then suddenly broke off, held his breath and then coughed. Behind the infirmary's doors a knock came. Osrith put her hand to Ba, ignoring the plaintive questions from behind it. He was still coughing, unable to catch his breath, and Osrith moved to hand him more water. But it was then that Edra put out a tiny hand. Bika spluttered to a stop, and stared at the child, looking over her features, pale skin, hazel eyes, hair as red as a dimming fire. "Edra," he said softly. Then, Bika cried too, and Osrith lifted Edra up to him as tears streamed down his face. He pulled his daughter closer, his arms stronger than they appeared. "I remember the first time I saw Thyra." He was talking now, to no one in particular. She was in pain. In her mind. He was still looking upon Edra, who was sitting quietly beside him. Her hair was matted. Clothes filthy. Torn. She had injuries. All over her body. Self-inflicted. But to me. She was the most. Marvelous human. Pitiful. She had strength. He turned his head sharply to Osrith. King Constantine keeps her well, with silver utods. He is a good boy, to do that, murmured Bika, taking Edra's hands in his own. Osrith took a step back, her own eyes betraying tears once more. 88,888,888. Night came. Hild, no doubt pressed by the nun, returned to Bika. His eyes were closed, and he was breathing. Edra, too, was sleeping in Osrith's arms. Hild put a hand out to Osrith as the nun who had been caring for him took her place at Bika's side. I can find her room in the palace nursery, Hild ventured. And Osrith yielded. And you will be. Hild's pale blue eyes twinkled. But Osrith didn't need to answer. She had returned to Bika's bedside and was standing by it as the old priest, Osrith's first ally, closed his eyes. Hild nodded, and turned to go. But Osrith asked, "Saynid?" With steeper, she replied in hushed tones, as Edra's hair fell over the abbess's shoulder, eyes tight closed. Osrith's eyes widened. Not fighting, drinking. He is waiting for you, Osrith. In both senses, Osrith considered. Hild was a shrewd woman. Osrith knew exactly what the abbess wished to ask her, as she opened her mouth and took half a step towards Osrith. But, clearly, the holy woman thought better of it and instead, shuffled Edra higher into her arms and stepped past the infirmary doors, closing them behind her. As the evening turned to night, as the nun nursed him, Father Bika slipped from one world to another. It was a strange sound, as his body shut down. Clicks of release of sinews, of gas, came from the bed as Bika's body came to rest. Processes shut down and decay was imminent. Leaving the woman to clean the body, Osrith moved to the door in a silence practiced over decades and crossed the now deserted hall of the monastery. Bika. The guardhouse was across a small courtyard between the palace and the monastery. The night was cold, and she slipped by the well, kneeling down, her hair whipping by her ears. Edra could sleep in the carriage they could buy with Dash. She dislodged a brick, hoping the cache of silver coins had not been discovered. Success. Osrith pressed the bag flat and forced it into her tunic. Utad, again, was aiding her passage north. Edra could sleep as they travelled to Hampton, hire a Frisian to sail them to, if not Alba, at least north. A cold wind blew as she turned the corner to the guardhouse. Saynid would be there and Dash. The guardhouse was deserted. Sighing, Osrith considered where to look next. Back to the nuns, back to Edra. She made to leave, eyeing discarded stone jars, once filled with ale, she supposed, reflecting in near-spent candles. But her way was blocked by two palace guards, their matching helmets betraying their employment. Osrith did not know them. Her hand was on buay, ready to fight. The king, intoned one, wishes to see the messenger from Alba. Their spears were immobile but insistent. It wasn't worth fighting them immediately, and, a thought occurred to her. Hild must have conveyed the gift. We are to depart. The king knows this. Osrith could not speak his name, could not think it. She had done what she came to do. She would grieve for Bika later. The king wills you to attend him. While she could not think of an alternative to hasten them out of Wessex, Osrith followed the guards, into the palace. While Winchester were markedly changed, she was struck by the continuity, the vast endurance of the stone. Identical in her memory as now, before her eyes. Up the same passageway, as she had so many times before, flanked by men such as these, to be on guard for the Etheling. Rounding a corner, on the way to the royal rooms. Did Elswith, Alfred's widow, endure? So many times had Osrith stepped aside so the lady could sweep by, head high, eye firm. She could see her now, cornering a maid to attend Ethelfled, steeper to attend the king at a meeting. All now, gone, and a new order now. One where Edward's new queen, Ethelm's daughter, Elfled, ruled. Not as a lady, but as an anointed queen, with accompanying privilege of power. Guards, in matching mail, stood outside the throne room, and Osrith paused. Was she ready? She would never be ready to see Edward again. What she had done with him had been survival. She did not want to confront her past, but think of the future, without Wessex, without her brother involved in any of it. Edward was waiting for her. He sat on the throne made for his grandfather of carved oak, his father's circlet upon his fair head of silling hair. He looked magnificent, and when his eyes caught Osrith's, the slight flicker at the corners of his mouth made Osrith's resolve weaken. But she was determined to steal her heart, guard her soul from the man who always seemed to know how to seduce her. Now, tonight, here ... it would be different. Edra was sleeping. Saynid was ... somewhere. Edward flicked his hand towards the guards, who bowed their heads, then left. Osrith and Edward, King of Wessex, were alone. I see Hild brought the king's gift to you. Osrith looked, pointedly, to the illustrated Bible. It is good to see you again, Osrith. His face softened, and the boy Osrith knew appeared within the king's features. I would have brought it myself, as I was commanded to by Constantine ... But Osrith faltered. Oh, Bokar, she mourned silently to herself, as the candles danced their light around King Edward. Hild informed me. I am sorry for it. He shifted on the throne, staring down Osrith. He was a good man. He reached for the Bible. No scholar like Alfred, Edward did not open it, but placed it on his lap. Hild informs me his daughter is sleeping contentedly and that your man is at the Two Cranes Inn with Steeper. Osrith gave a wry smile. Two warriors, identical jobs, unable to understand one another, united in weapons and ale or whiskey, if Saynid could manage to locate some. And you have lived back with the Picts again? There was not so much disdain in his voice, but disappointment. Osrith felt her heart lurch. She had caused that, to the Etheling, the king, like when Ethelfled, who at 12 should have known better, had taken a toy from him, usually his wooden horse, and hidden it for spite. Disappointed that the sister he looked up to had always been cruel to him. Not Osrith, not tonight. With the Picts, Scoti, Strathclydians and especially the Gaels, all people of Alba. And why not? Osrith argued with Edward, silently. Northumbria has more in common with the people of Alba than it does with Wessex. It was the first time, returned as she was to Wessex, that she associated herself with Bibbenberg. Uthed had not claimed it. Elfric still ruled and he had no son of his own to follow himself. Why should she not? Your daughter Edra rests well, Edward went on, and her father has just died. Bokar. Edward opened his eyes just a little, yielding to surprise me. You ... do surprise me, Osrith. She is adopted. Her mother, Thyra, Bokar's wife, died suspicious, terrible circumstances, if you recall. And your own two princes, Elfred and Eartred. No, Osrith replied, uncertainly. I recall ... twins, a boy and a girl. My firstborn son completes his training at Ethelfled's estate. Edith belongs to God. Edward looked furtive, like when she would chastise him for not cleaning his mail, or not practicing with his sword that which she had taught him. Of course, Edward looked impassive, no hint of emotion or turmoil at the hint of a memory of his first wife, whom Osrith had watched marry him as an Etheling. Ecgwin. She was so beautiful, a soft loveliness, like a butterfly resting in midsummer, waving its wings like a heartbeat, or the glance of translucent copy paper from a scriptorium on the skin. And now, as if the name of Aethelstan was lost to him, lost to duty rather than desire. It was the night that Alfred had demanded he take responsibility for his fitch, the day the king had told his son, the Etheling, that his wife had been taken to a nunnery and the babies torn from her. He had been rough with Osrith that night, all the Etheling's usual tenderness gone, and she had conceived. She had, as usual, gone to allow with silver stolen, as usual, from Uthed, and she had bled, the remnants of the conception expelling from her body heavily and painfully. Osrith had been angry, and angrier when Uthed challenged her after suspecting she had been near his home. They had fought, but Osrith hadn't the strength to better him like last time, and had fled. Finan had cared enough. Follow her, despite Osrith's protestations, and as she passed out from blood loss, he made out her vague instructions about Crapelgate and had carried her back to Allah, begging and demanding in turn that the healer saved her. Come. Edward got to his feet, his long cloak spilling out behind him. I must show you the armory. So, she walked with him, through the throne room and out where the guards polished their metal and the horses' bridles hung. It was like Osrith's second home, and it, too, hadn't changed. Elfled insists on matching uniform. As her father's guards, Edward continued. She is very single-minded about how the palace should be run. Osrith reached up to the faceplate of one of the helmets. Frankish steel, thrice kneeled, harder than flint. She was aware Edward was touching her, ever so gently, at the small of the back. He was so close, and she had allowed what she had sworn she would not do, to be so close to the king. And here, Merson leather. Welishulk. Osrith reached up to feel that and hide. Edward touched her hip, gently, as if escorting her, a touch that was beguiling, thralling, as if it would be madness to deny him. Please express my thanks. One king to another. Edward breathed near Osrith's ear. Constantine is good to you. Indeed, Osrith lied. She must steal her will. Stepping away, she changed the subject. And he fights for you still, Utad? Edward shifted his feet. Osrith moved out of his reach, inspecting the steel-flanged shields. At Fangforder, in Gloucester, at Ethelflaed's estate. He is her Oathman. Good. His men are there also. I do not care. So, Finan was not at Winchester. Osrith did care, and was glad he was far from Wessex. Her compacted emotion for Bicker's death would not stand meeting Finan M8 Ah. What was he to you, Osrith, the Irishman? Edward demanded. Finan had remained with her until she was well, at the house Osrith rented on the western edge of the city. Not even Sihik demanding he return to Utad's service, not even sending of a silver coin had compelled him to leave her. And when she was well, he had to be pulled back by Utad to prevent him storming into the palace in search of Edward. The Etheling had discovered her brother Oathman's love for her. Then, if only Osrith had known it, her life might have been quite different. But then, it could not have been. How could she possibly be with Finan when all she sought was to murder her brother? A blade between my shoulders. And, had Utad known of her loss? Osrith wondered about that. Now, he was crueler than she could say if he had let Ethelwold abuse her anyway. Osrith, Edward said to her, gravely, I understand why you felt the need for Constantine to vouch for your visit to Wessex. He held up the parchment written, from what Osrith could see, by a monk, probably Blathmac, the elderly abbot of Culdy's monastery. There was a rumor, no evidence, you understand, of witchcraft. Please. He shot out a hand as Osrith backed away. You may go back to Alba, the king said, for I may have need of you. Beauty, undimmed by adulthood, shone out from his face, a glamour which had made her pursue unwise choices so many times before. Then, concluded Osrith, I bid you farewell, Lord King, and she stepped past him, and out onto the path that led out towards the monastery. A guard stood, silently still, by the threshold. A cold rain had begun, damp and fine. She would find Sainid and they could find a room at the inn, collect Edra in the morning. She was aware Edward was still behind her, and she turned. Good night, she said, again. Osrith, the night is dangerous. She couldn't help but laugh. She had loved many men, in body, but he was the only one who could seduce her. And the girl, Edward pressed on, she is enjoying the comfort of a bed in the nursery, I'm told. Third time. That was the third time he'd told her. Before Osrith could say anything he leaned close to her, taking each of her hands gently in his. Osrith, he whispered by her ear, his breath a light breeze, making her remember long summer nights when it had been just Edward and her, where the night lasted forever and morning was a yellow glow over the meadows of Winchester. Of nights where the Etheling had run fingers along her arm and lowered his head to her ear, his breath sweet and warm and, as always, beguiling. When he took Osrith's shoulder then ran his hand down to her tunic, unlacing it deftly until it fell away to her feet. As he had done, now. Only, they were no longer in the courtyard. Somehow, they were in his bedchamber, where he slept as an earthling. A cold night was hammering raindrops onto the stone walls outside. His hands were cold as he placed one on her bare back and the other on her stomach, working their way up over ribs towards her bound breasts. Osrith shivered. She was no longer a young woman, and yet she felt 16 again, remembering the same dexterity of fingers of the man before her as when he had first commanded her. She was still, so many years later, desirable to the King of Wessex, and he had proved he could still seduce her despite her will to resist. Osrith turned her head. Edward held close. He was warm and firm, and his mouth moved close to her ear as his hands remembered her body. "Stay,"